Hello, Entertainment and New Media Law class. Welcome to the first lecture in this module of our class. In this class, I want to talk about some of the background for how I'm thinking about this class and how we're structuring this class. And one of the main themes that I think informs this class is the concept of convergence, of media convergence. How are various different forms of media, audio, video, written word, music, film, all sorts of different kinds of media converging and coming together and being made available across various kinds of platforms so that you can have access to different kinds of media in all sorts of different ways. A good example of that, and one of the reasons I'm doing this class in this kind of hybrid format, is this class itself. So you are looking at a PowerPoint slide, which is a certain kind of text media. You are listening to my voice here, which is an audio recording. All of this has been bundled into a video. It's being delivered to you over the internet. You may be watching it on your laptop, you may be watching it on your phone or your iPad or some other kind of device. If you wanted to, I suppose, you could beam it to your television. So this is a good example of convergence in itself. And this theme of convergence has been a very big theme in media studies and in media since at least the dawn of the internet era. I certainly remember in the mid-1990s when I was a young lawyer and the internet was a relatively new thing, a lot of discussion about multimedia. They weren't quite using the term convergence yet, but a lot of discussion about multimedia. Then the notion that you would have a smartphone in your pocket from which you could pull out and pull down and watch a movie or something like that was really just a gleam in some forward-thinking people's eyes. It wasn't really something that was possible, and of course now it's possible. In the future, even more incredible things, I think, will be possible. So our topic in this class is this idea of convergence and how media convergence intersects with existing legal frameworks and how legal frameworks may change or need to change or ought to change in relation to the ongoing phenomenon of media convergence. So let's talk for a little bit in this lecture about what is this idea of media convergence and what are, just as a broad brush overview, some of the legal frameworks that will apply and that we'll be digging into in further classes in this module. So first, this question of convergence, and I'm going to give you some ways of thinking about convergence by a media scholar named Henry Jenkins, who is now, I believe, out at USC, who used to be at MIT. And Jenkins has written some academic work as well as a lot of popular work on this question of convergence. And this is taken from an article that Jenkins published in the MIT Technology Review in 2001. And if you'll notice, Jenkins at that time is pushing back a little bit against some concepts that were floating around at the time about what convergence is and what it means. Now, if you look at that date, 2001, 15 or 16 years ago, depending on when you're taking this class or hearing this lecture, that is obviously an eternity in the internet age. Quite a lot has happened technologically, quite a lot has happened politically and socially and a fair amount has happened in the legal landscape since that time. So I think it's interesting to look at what Jenkins comes up with. A lot of what he's saying, I think, is still very important for today, but we can also think about it in terms of, how have things perhaps changed. So Jenkins is going to break up this idea of convergence into a number of different layers or buckets or categories. So the first thing he talks about is technological convergence. So the idea that where previously the technology relied on electrons, basically. So if you think about old cathode ray tube television screens or even tube radio sets, right? This is relying on the properties of electrons and electricity to communicate information. And now what Jenkins is suggesting is that all these different ways of communicating information, whether it's over radio, whether it's television broadcasting, are now all converted to the digital domain. Now, of course, the digital domain involves, the layer of physics too. Everything has to obey the laws of physics. So when you're communicating information digitally, you're still involving, atoms and then more fundamental laws of physics. But the point is, everything is digital now. And when everything is digital, you've got a medium, a kind of currency, so to speak, that will allow anything to be exchanged, any kind of media to be exchanged. In the past, you couldn't really readily convert, say, a radio broadcast to a television broadcast. Of course, you could do it. You could retransmit it. You could record it and retransmit it or something like that. But there were issues about loss of signal, loss of integrity of the data. The more recordings you make of an analog tape, the information degrades, the data degrades, the quality degrades. That doesn't happen in the digital domain. So the second thing Jenkins mentions is economic convergence. So here he is suggesting that the entertainment industry in particular is beginning to integrate. And he talks here about the horizontal integration. So if you think about the way industries are structured, or the way the delivery of a good or a service is structured, you can think about a vertical kind of integration. So, how are things produced? How's the most basic unit? Let's take something a little more tangible, like building a railroad, right? So you've got steel that you need for the rail lines. Somebody's producing the steel. And then you need someone to take that steel and to manufacture the raw steel into railroad lines. So somebody's got to do that. Then you have to have somebody that goes and surveys where the railroad will go and find the right place for it to go. Someone's got to do that. Then someone has to build it. Someone has to actually put the railroad lines and ties down onto the place where the surveyor came up with, right? And then someone has to build the engines and the rail cars and engineer those. And then someone has to actually be able to pilot the engine, be an engineer, all those sorts of things. So you could have different companies delivering all those services, or you could vertically integrate that into one company delivering all those services. And indeed, we saw all that in the 19th century. And that was what led to the first comprehensive antitrust laws in the United States, was the integration of those industries and the question of whether that was a healthy thing for the economy or not. So that's kind of a vertical integration. But a horizontal level would be entities that are delivering a service at the same level. So let's take, again, railroads. Let's say that you have two different companies that are constructing railroad lines out of raw steel. Those two companies are competing with each other. They're each doing that. Let's say that there are different gauges of railroad lines for different purposes. So you have those two companies. So those are horizontal competitors. And again, part of what the antitrust laws in the 19th century initially were designed to do was to limit to a certain degree the ability of horizontal competition to be concentrated. Because, when you think about this kind of concentration, especially with horizontal competition, because then, of course, you've got competitors or potential competitors at the same level agreeing not to compete, and that leads to oligopoly or monopoly, obviously hurts competition. And so Jenkins suggested back in 2001 that this is what is happening in the entertainment industry, that you will see a small number of large players controlling a variety of outlets. Jenkins also talks about social or organic convergence. And here what he's talking about is how consumers acquire and use information. What kinds of outlets do consumers use to get information? So whereas in the past it might have been that people would get their hard news from a paper newspaper and would get their softer or local news from a local television news broadcast, again, Jenkins said those channels will begin to converge. And then cultural convergence. Jenkins talks about forms of creativity, ways in which regular people will use media and different kinds of media to communicate with each other and to create their own forms of entertainment and the like. And then Jenkins talks about global convergence. So the fact that you're transforming atoms to bits and you're creating this new digital media and that this is accessible globally over the internet means that various different cultural channels that would have remained separate or at least somewhat distinct will begin to blend and merge. So I think if you look at all these areas of convergence that Jenkins was talking about in 2001, in many ways they definitely resonate today, maybe even in ways that Jenkins himself would not have fully anticipated. Certainly global convergence, certainly degrees of cultural convergence, social convergence, technological convergence. Maybe the one that is the most interesting, though, and that perhaps didn't quite play out exactly the way Jenkins thought it would, is this question of economic convergence. So when Jenkins is writing in 2001, some of the big players that were around in 2001 are not even really around anymore. And some of the big players today weren't really around or around substantially in 2001. So the market perhaps has not developed in exactly the way that Jenkins was thinking in 2001. It has developed in ways that perhaps are more competitive than he would have thought, or in some ways perhaps there are still movements toward horizontal integration. And that's that question of how the markets, how the business environment, how the entities that are delivering content, creating content, and able to do that, how they are competing with each other and relating to each other is going to be one of the themes of our class. So it's one of the themes of how the law is going to relate to this era of new media. One of the things I think I put in one of the early course descriptions here was talking about the phenomenon of the professional YouTuber. This was something, of course, that didn't exist in 2001. So now you have people like, say, PewDiePie, the guy who reviews video games, making millions of dollars putting up YouTube content, and it's content that in the not too distant past nobody would have really paid any attention to at all. So you do have that phenomenon. You do have individuals who are able to not only make a living but make a very good living creating and curating and producing content. But the question is, how long will that kind of thing last? How long will that sort of disruption last? And or to what degree will there be a broader kind of corporate control concentrated in the hands of a few very small media companies over that kind of content? And indeed, the acquisition of YouTube by Google raises that very kind of question, because while Google isn't owning or controlling PewDiePie per se, Google does control the channel. And what Google does with things like DMCA takedown notices on that channel can have a big impact. And we'll see that when we talk more about the DMCA.